footage. It's dark and hard to make out, but sure enough, it looks like something is there. It could be about the size of a human, but it's hard to say for certain because it seems to be almost laying on the floor. At first, it just kind of looks like a white blob that's there as the investigators are looking in the other direction. It doesn't react instantly as they start walking backwards, but suddenly, the shape moves, crawling or slithering. Its movement somewhere between a snake and a crocodile, as it silently moves towards the doorway to its right, before disappearing out of shot. Many have said to have seen these so-called creepers over the years since, shadowy human-like figures that crawl between the rooms of Ward R, but they apparently aren't the only residents of the asylum that still reside there to this day. But of course, when talking about a Victorian-age mental hospital, ghosts are one thing, but there are undeniably very real-world horrors that have taken place within these stone walls. They apparently aren't the only residents of the asylum that still reside there to this day. But of course, when talking about a Victorian-age mental hospital, ghosts are one thing, but there are undeniably very real-world horrors that have taken place within these stone walls. One afternoon in 1841, a woman by the name of Dorothea Dix was teaching a Sunday school class at the East Cambridge Jail in Massachusetts. After her class ended, she asked if she would be able to tour the facilities. She had a particular interest in how they kept their patients who suffered from mental illnesses, and what she saw disgusted her. She witnessed prisoners chained to walls in flimsy clothing. There was no heat and no ventilation. These were not criminals. These were people who had been, in many cases, left there because their families either couldn't or didn't want to care for them. When Dorothea asked the guard why they were being kept like this, the guard didn't see the issue, telling her that mentally ill people can't feel heat anyway. One of the most famous and sad stories of murder within the asylum came as a result of the overcrowding situation. In the initial designs, as I said, it was planned that the most violent residents were to be kept away from the rest of the general population. But as intake grew, this got harder to maintain. I'm unsure if this was an example of a resident being placed wherever they could, or a mistake by an overstretched staff member. But at one point, a particularly vulnerable patient was taken into the asylum and placed in a room with 2 violent offenders. The 3 men were not checked on for several hours. When staff returned, they discovered a horrifying sight. The new patient had been attacked by the 2 more violent residents. Being no one had time to check on them, they were effectively given hours to torture the new patient, initially attempting to hang him numerous times from the water pipes that ran along the tops of many rooms. They had not been successful in their murderous plan, so instead they proceeded to bash the metal bed frame into the man's head until he died. In the end, it took 2 months before she was discovered. Over the years, increasingly violent reports were coming out of the asylum. According to an article by Discover America, female staff members were met with persistent physical and sexual harassment by the hospital's most aggressive inmates. One story is reported in a number of sources, although I struggle to find a name or initial source for this story. But it is said that a nurse working a late shift one evening left the main building to go and do a check on the wards. Only a small handful of staff were working at night, so she was forced to do the checks alone. An hour later, her colleagues grew concerned when she hadn't returned. A few hours passed before they began the search, but could find no trace of her. In the end, it took 2 months before she was discovered. It is a testament to the state the hospital was in at this point that no one had noticed the smell. Her decomposing body was found at the bottom of a disused stairwell. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Her killer was never discovered. Within the first 30 years of operation, people had been committed for bad habits, bad whiskey, a rattlesnake bite, business nerves, cold, multiple masturbation-related committals, including one where someone had been masturbating for 30 years apparently, disappointment, desertion by husband, dog bites, doubt about his mother's ancestors, female disease, greediness, ill-treated by husband, jealousy, business trouble, marriage of son, menstrually deranged, nymphomania, novel reading, overheating, parents were cousins, political reasons, shooting of daughter, that one might be fair, suppressed masturbation, so apparently masturbating too much or too little, were grounds for ending up in a mental institution, superstition, woman troubles, worms, and even sunstroke. Multiple family members were often kept within the asylum. Came along Dr. Walter Freeman, a man who had come up with a quicker and inexpensive way of carrying out a lobotomy. He called it the transorbital lobotomy, although it would become more known to the public by the term ice pick lobotomy. Dr. Freeman would charge $25 for the lobotomy. They would give the patient a quick shock of electricity to numb them slightly, and would then insert a metal pick into the corner of each eye socket of the patient, moving it back and forth to sever the connections to the prefrontal cortex. Dr. Freeman travelled the country, offering this service to many asylums to help cure their patients of their mental issues. In many cases, hospitals contacted the families to get permission, without explaining what the procedure was. Dr. Freeman would go on to perform thousands of lobotomies, the most famous of which was to the sister of John F. Kennedy, Rosemary Kennedy. The procedure left her with severe mental and physical disabilities. While for some people the lobotomy had some beneficial aspects, many were left in a worse state than they were in before the surgery. The death rate from the ice pick lobotomy is debated, but some sources believe it could be as high as 15% of patients. Nick suggests they walk backwards, while still watching the space he saw it in. The cameraman tries to get focus on the pair as they step back, but then he freezes, telling them to stop with a seriousness that snaps their attention to him. He zooms into the background behind them, desperately trying to get focus. He saw something, but isn't sure what. The investigators ask him what he's looking for, to which he replies, "Shh." In what feels like a weirdly realistic reaction to something creepy happening on a ghost hunting show, he doesn't get excited. His mind shuts down, at least temporarily. If all this wasn't bad enough, there was also the treatments that the patients were subjected to. One of my main sources for this episode was The Haunted History of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum by Sherry Brake, and in her book she lists a whole host of treatments that were considered commonplace in many Victorian-built asylums. I don't believe all of these were carried out at Trans-Allegheny, but a number of them were. There was bloodletting, the process of bleeding a patient by opening a vein with a small knife, seemingly with the intention of letting out whatever bad stuff within a person's blood was causing their madness. This process of bleeding was used in the early days of the asylum. Then there was trepanation, an early precursor to the lobotomy, where someone would drill a small hole into the skull of a patient, a technique that was used for thousands of years. There was hydrotherapy, based on the idea that a bath was a calming experience. Hyperactive patients were given long hot baths that would tire them out, whereas lethargic patients would be put into icy cold water. At times, the temperatures were so extreme that many patients received burns. Reports from the Western Hospital suggest patients could be left within these baths for hours, restrained while they were. Some had high-powered jets used on them, where they would be chained to a wall and blasted with water from a fire hose. It's hard not to be concerned that people who had been bitten by a dog were ending up in the same place as murderers. It's also been noted how easy it was back then for a husband to have his wife institutionalized. In many cases, a patient could only be taken out of the hospital by the person who had initially committed them, not by another member of their family. Accusations have been made that rather than go through the process of divorce, some men would instead find a reason to have their wife hospitalized in asylums. Obviously, these are just short descriptions we have of why each patient was omitted in the records, so we don't have a full picture of their mental condition. But it's hard not to be concerned that people who had been bitten by a dog were ending up in the same place as murderers. By the 1950s, it was estimated that over 2,400 residents were being kept at the asylum. Rooms intended for one were housing up to 10 people, and the halls were full of beds to try and cover the overspill. When they ran out of beds, patients started sleeping on the cold floors. This extreme overpopulation led to horrific conditions. Overcrowded rooms, sanitation was abysmal, and resources were stretched beyond capacity. Patients suffered from malnutrition, neglect, and in some cases, outright abuse. Welcome to the tape library. This is one quite a few of you have requested I get into. Fair warning, this is obviously going to get pretty dark in places. Just a quick note regarding the name. Lunatic asylum is obviously quite an outdated term. In fact, it didn't even keep this name for that long during its early history in the 1800s. But it was the original name given to the building, and subsequently the building has been renamed this in more recent years. But we can talk about that a bit more later. In this episode, we'll be exploring the history of the asylum, the various horrific events that took place there during its years of operation, before finally getting into the reported paranormal aspects of the story. I've mentioned in the past that I'm not the biggest fan of ghost hunting shows, but I found the footage I spoke about at the start of the episode genuinely unsettling, so I'm curious. Have you ever seen anything on a paranormal show that has genuinely made you consider something supernatural might actually be taking place? Let me know in the comments. The fourth floor is often said to be the most terrifying area of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, if you believe the many ghost hunters that have visited over the years since its closure in 1994. Specifically, Ward R, where the creepers are said to live. It likely wasn't the first sighting, but the creepers were apparently made famous by an episode of Paranormal Lockdown, which saw paranormal investigators Nick Groff, Katrina Weidman, and their cameraman Rob staying inside the asylum for 72 hours. The now infamous clip takes place 60 hours into their investigation, deep inside Ward R late at night. The investigators are convinced they keep seeing shadows walking around further down the corridors of the ward. At times, insulin was used to put patients into temporary comas, which became a trend after it apparently cured a drug addict of her morphine addiction. And of course, there was electroconvulsion therapy, the act of hitting the brain with a series of electric shocks designed to cause mini seizures that would affect the patient's brain function. However, the treatment that certainly was the most infamously used at Western State Hospital was the lobotomy. The surgery causes most of the connections to the prefrontal cortex to be severed. Initially in most American asylums, this was carried out by drilling into the skull, meaning it had to be done in an operating room by a trained neurosurgeon. But then came along Dr. Walter Freeman, a man who had come up with a quicker and inexpensive way of carrying out a lobotomy. He called it the transorbital lobotomy, although it would become more known to the public by the term ice pick lobotomy. The construction initially started using prison inmates to build it. This would lead to the first of many incidents at the location, when a number of inmates staged an escape, stabbing one guard in the process. They were quickly captured, and over time the state moved away from using the prisoners to complete the construction. The Civil War created some delays as well. In 1861, the war caused all construction to stop, and the partially built facility was used as a fort, changing hands several times between both sides throughout the war, which saw many of the supplies that had been set aside for the first batch of patients being taken. When the war came to an end, the town of Weston now sat in the newly formed West Virginia, and one of the state's first acts was to push ahead the completion of what was now to be called the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane. The hospital initially opened in 1864, housing just 9 patients, all of whom were female. The now infamous clip takes place 60 hours into their investigation, deep inside Ward R late at night. The investigators are convinced they keep seeing shadows walking around further down the corridors of the ward. The camera, however, doesn't see anything, just the darkness of the long corridor. But the investigators are anxious, seemingly genuinely scared by whatever seems to keep appearing to them, just out of shot. But of course, they've been inside one of America's most infamous asylums for 2 days at this point. It's not surprising that their eyes and minds may be playing tricks on them. It's not just quick movements in the corner of their eyes though. At one point, Nick believes he saw what looked to be a man standing there staring at them from the darkness, but as though he were made entirely of shadow. They approached where he saw the shadow, but there was no trace of anyone. It was a far cry from the previous imprisonment that many faced, and a surprisingly empathetic plan for Victorian culture. This wouldn't have been possible without the work of Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, who had begun developing plans for how these hospitals should be laid out. He proposed a design that saw a central building that would house offices, staff quarters and kitchens. Then there would be wings extending off from this central point, where patients would be housed. Each ward within these wings was staggered rather than all being in a straight line, creating a more compact feel, rather than just an endlessly long imposing corridor. This would also allow each ward to receive more natural daylight. This was a key part of his plan. The hospitals would have large windows, allowing light and fresh air to pass in. The ground surrounding the hospital would be large and beautiful. The patients would have as much freedom as could possibly be allowed. Kirkbride and Dix were very conscious of the fact that the environment these patients were in could be a huge factor in any attempt at treatment. These would be places where the intention was to cure people and get them back into society wherever possible, not to simply lock them away. It was a far cry from the previous imprisonment that many faced, and a surprisingly empathetic plan for Victorian culture. But then, Rob sees it. The investigators keep asking him what's wrong, but he struggles to speak. In what feels like a weirdly realistic reaction to something creepy happening on a ghost hunting show. He doesn't scream. He doesn't get excited. He freezes. His mind shuts down, at least temporarily. When he regains his composure, he tells them that he is convinced he saw something move against the back wall behind them. Something low to the ground. A shape of some kind. Still shaking, Rob and the investigators head to the back of the hall and look into the room he was sure he saw it move into, but there's nothing there. They push Rob to explain what he saw, but he struggles to put it into words, saying it was big but looked like it kind of slithered off, like some sort of snake or lizard. They decided to review the variations of this technique were used over the years. Reports from the Western Hospital suggest patients could be left within these baths for hours, restrained while they were. Some had high-powered jets used on them, where they would be chained to a wall and blasted with water from a fire hose. Various uses of confinement were used in many asylums, including Trans-Allegheny. These ranged from simple isolation cells to cribs that almost resembled coffins, that a patient would be forced to stay in for an extended amount of time. Others were placed in effectively cages, or chained to seats with a box of sorts over their heads to block out outside stimulation. This was used as both a form of treatment, but also as a way of dealing with troublesome inmates. Some sources claim that if a patient was complaining about the conditions at Trans-Allegheny, they would simply be moved into isolation, or locked into one of the cribs. The tight confined cribs were noted as having many negative effects on not just the patient's mental well-being, but their physical health as well, with some being left inside for so long they struggled to walk afterwards. The threat of fires was constantly brought up over the years, but nothing was done to improve fire safety, leading to numerous times that patients set fires that destroyed chunks of the asylum. Then there was the White Death, tuberculosis. The problems with TB were certainly not just an issue within the asylum. Outbreaks towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th were a huge issue for the country as a whole. Initially spread through the consumption of unpasteurized cow's milk, poor living conditions and crowded environments were often cited as major contributors to the spread of the disease. Doctors of the time blamed the poor for the spreading. Public health campaigns warned people of steps they could take to limit the spread, including quarantine, but these were largely ignored. It was believed that UV light could help cure the disease, and when a TB building was constructed at the asylum, year-round open porches were used for patients, no matter the weather, in the hope that the fresh air and sunlight would cure them. Unfortunately, the disease was airborne, so their attempts to cure the patients simply spread it further. It spread so widely throughout the community that the Charleston Gazette put out an article in the 60s that the entire population of Weston would be offered free x-rays to check if they were infected. Countless patients would die from tuberculosis within the walls of the asylum. That one might be fair. Suppressed masturbation, so apparently masturbating too much or too little, were grounds for ending up in a mental institution. Superstition, woman troubles, worms, and even sunstroke. Multiple family members were often kept within the asylum. Some would spend their entire life there because they simply had nowhere else to go, even in some cases being born and dying within its walls, never knowing a life outside. It's also been noted how easy it was back then for a husband to have his wife institutionalized. In many cases, a patient could only be taken out of the hospital by the person who had initially committed them, not by another member of their family. Accusations have been made that rather than go through the process of divorce, some men would instead find a reason to have their wife hospitalized in asylums like Trans-Allegheny. Obviously, these are just short descriptions we have of why each patient was omitted in the records, so we don't have a full picture of their mental condition. Over the following years, the hospital would gradually take in more and more patients, before the hospital was finally completed in 1871. The following year, the hospital would almost instantly reach its planned capacity, when it housed 241 patients. The hospital itself was a stunning building, the largest stone-cut building in all of the US, and according to some sources, only the second largest worldwide to the Kremlin. It had the look of a Gothic castle or high-end boarding school, more so than a mental hospital. With its stunning architecture, some point to the stone faces that adorn the outside of its walls as providing a slightly more sinister feel. The outside grounds were equally beautiful, with plenty of space to walk around its 27 acres. The facility was designed to be self-sufficient, with a farm, waterworks, and even a cemetery all being part of the compound. An account of the facilities was printed in 1871 shortly after opening, that commented on how spacious, clean and pleasant everything was, noting that most of the residents were free to pretty much take care of themselves, but still get the help they needed during their stay. While the asylum was designed to be self-sufficient, it was not built for this many people. There was a lack of food available and other basic needs. While construction was started to try and expand the hospital, it was never able to keep up with the demands. The media were quick to jump on the asylum, and several exposés were written about the standards that could be found at the Western State Hospital, as it was now called. Although in some cases, staff did come out publicly to defend the place, saying that while there were issues, they didn't like the picture of abuse that was being painted, claiming that many of the staff were in fact caring people who were doing the best they could for their patients, but the funding and overcrowding were making it borderline impossible. Over the years, increasingly violent reports were coming out of the asylum. According to an article by Discover America, female staff members were met with persistent physical and sexual harassment by the hospital's most aggressive inmates. One story is reported in a number of sources, although I struggle to find a name or initial source for this story. When Dorothea asked the guard why they were being kept like this, the guard didn't see the issue, telling her that mentally ill people can't feel heat anyway. Dorothea was spurred on by what she saw, and in just a few short years she was able to present her findings to the Massachusetts legislator, who agreed to provide funds to improve the facilities for those with mental illnesses. Her work didn't stop there though, and she took her crusade across the US and Europe, arguing that we needed a better way to treat such people. This ultimately led to the birth of the state hospital, institutions that would house people with mental health conditions and attempt to treat them rather than simply throwing away the key and forgetting about them in some prison cell. This wouldn't have been possible without the work of Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, who had begun developing plans for how these hospitals should be laid out. He proposed a design that saw a central building that would house offices, staff quarters and kitchens. Then there would be wings extending off from this central point, where patients would be housed. Each ward within these wings was staggered rather than all being in a straight line, creating a more compact feel, rather than just an endlessly long imposing corridor.
Drift for a moment into the quiet corners of another time. A place where mercy wore the mask of medicine. In the 19th century, they built grand asylums to heal the broken mind. But within their walls, kindness often gave way to cruelty. Patients whispered to shadows. Doctors wrote reports no one dared read twice. And the night was never truly silent. These stories come from those forgotten halls, where the sane and the mad shared the same locked doors and the echo of a single footstep could wake the dead. So settle in, breathe slowly, and if you hear a voice in the dark, it's only a memory finding its way back. The Asylum Ledger. In the year of our Lord 1856, the state of Ohio enacted a law most intricate and precise, a law designed, as they said, to ensure the proper regulation and humane treatment of the insane. The parchment bore the signatures of gentlemen of great repute, men who smiled for portraits and signed with confidence that ink could bring order to the chaos of the human mind. But ink has always had its darker purpose. The act divided the state into 3 regions, the northern, central, and southern districts, each tethered to its own asylum. Newburgh, Columbus, and Dayton became names spoken with reverence in the courtrooms and with dread in the parlors. Each building rose from the earth with the same stern geometry. Brick and iron walls thick enough to muffle both conscience and sound. They called them institutions. Those who lived near enough to hear the cries at night called them something else. They called them tombs for the living. The Central Ohio Asylum stood on a hill outside Columbus, its windows narrow as arrow slits, its chimneys sighing smoke that stung the eyes. The trustees spoke of it as a place of mercy, where the lost and troubled could be tended by science and faith alike. But the townsfolk said that once the gates closed, the air inside changed. Time itself grew heavy there, thick as the mildew that bloomed on the stone. It was in this place that the ledgers began. Each patient had a page, each page a history, each history an end. The clerks, pale men with sleepless eyes, wrote with unwavering care, their quills scratching long into the night. They recorded the particulars, name, sex, color, condition, and cause. 1,000 souls reduced to ink and rule lines. If a hand trembled, it was only fatigue. If the ink bled, it was only dampness from the walls. The superintendent, a man named Dr. Horace Blythe, was known for his composure. His spectacles never slipped, his coat never wrinkled. The newspapers spoke of his devotion to the afflicted. Attendance, a quieter legend, persisted. Wards did not disturb him because he no longer heard the human voice as such. He heard only data. Blythe had a private office adjoining the eastern wing. Within it were stacks of bound volumes, the official records of every soul ever confined under the Act of 1856. He called them his scripture of the mind. Each morning he read from them as others might from the Bible, whispering the names of the dead before lighting his pipe. "Order from madness," he would murmur. "The ledger is the cure." The law itself was thorough, almost tender in its cruelty. If a man or woman were accused of madness, the judge must hold a hearing. A respectable citizen would swear an affidavit declaring the subject insane. Witnesses were summoned, among them a physician. If the judge was satisfied, and he always was, a warrant was issued commanding the sheriff to take the accused to the asylum. The sheriff, in turn, was to ensure the patient was clean, properly clothed, and free from vermin. Thus began the descent. They arrived in carriages before dawn. The attendants met them at the gates, lanterns casting long shadows on the snow. Each new arrival was brought to the washroom first, stripped of worldly attire and clothed in dark wool. The superintendent greeted them not by name but by number. "Patient 84, he might say softly. "You will be content here." One left content. Some did not leave at all. In 1858, the first fire broke out, a small blaze in the record hall. The clerks swore they smelled smoke rising from the ledgers themselves, as if the names within resisted confinement. The flames consumed only a few shelves, yet those pages, those names, were gone forever. The doctor wept as he watched them burn, though whether from grief or rage no one could say. He ordered the survivors, the attendants and the clerks, to copy the remaining books by hand. "Memory is a fragile vessel," he said, "but record endures." For months the scratching of quills filled the hallways like the sound of rats in the walls. They copied and copied, the ink thickening like blood under their nails. When winter came, a fever took the youngest clerk. His final entry, written in a trembling hand, was a single line. "They whisper when the lamps go out." Decades passed. The asylum grew quiet, its courtyards overrun with nettles. By the time the Civil War came and went, the Central Ohio Asylum had taken in more than 2,000 souls. Of them, fewer than 100 were ever released. When inspectors from the capital arrived in 1873, they found the ledgers stacked from floor to ceiling. The oldest books were bound in human leather, though no one dared to say from whom. Dust lay thick on the ink, but the words beneath were still legible. Dates, causes, and a single recurring phrase beside certain names. "No discharge recorded." The inspectors closed the building a year later. The remaining patients were scattered to other institutions. The ledgers were locked in the cellar, forgotten beneath the collapsing floorboards. A century later, when the property was being cleared for a modern hospital, a crewman found one of those books sealed in a wooden crate. The leather binding had darkened, the ink faded to brown, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Fine, deliberate, unbroken. Inside the cover was a dedication to the state of Ohio, that it may never forget its duty to the disturbed and the damned. Signed, Dr. Horace Blythe, Superintendent, Central Asylum, 1856. The final page bore no patient's name, only a single line written in the same meticulous hand. When the record ends, so does the mind. And beneath it, faintly, as if written from the other side of the paper, another sentence, trembling and uneven. But I still hear them writing. The chained sane. There are few fates more terrible than burial before death, save perhaps one: to be locked alive among the mad while the world believes you belong there. Such was the dread that haunted the late age of asylums, where the law's ink was sharper than iron, and a signature could erase a soul. I, the gentleman of Beechhurst, George H. Newman of Beechhurst, Long Island, was a man of 77 years, an old merchant with clear eyes and a fondness for his nephews. He lived quietly by the sea, his days filled with the rhythm of the tide and the creak of the orchard gate. But one evening, as twilight dripped over the dunes, his nephews came calling. They brought with them a physician, introduced as a humanitarian, a word that would soon mock them all. They sat in the parlor laughing, drinking tea, listening as the old man told stories of his father, his youth, the ships that once came up the bay. They encouraged his talk, nodding, taking notes in their minds. Later, he would recall their faces, the polite smiles concealing something, observation perhaps, or calculation. Within the week, his wife signed a petition she did not understand. Within the fortnight, George Newman found himself in a motor car with two strangers, bound not for his physician in the Catskills as promised, but for Harlem Valley Hospital for the insane. He arrived at Wingdale under a forged commitment. His name entered a ledger he had never seen. 29 days later, when he emerged pale and trembling, the world looked different. The air itself seemed to judge him. 2. The paper cage. The matter might have been dismissed as a family dispute had not an investigator opened the drawers of the asylum's office and found 18 more commitments bearing the same forged signature. Dr. Earl C. Cheshire, the psychiatrist whose name adorned them, swore he had never seen these souls, never signed such orders, never spoken the words that condemned them. His signature had been traced by another hand, Miss Frances Surdez, the secretary of Dr. Sheehan, a man whose very position on the asylum's board forbade him from sending anyone within its walls. And yet, the names were there, written in the calm, bureaucratic ink of madness. 18 living people had been labeled insane by a pen that never met them. When the news reached New York, the grand jury trembled. Behind the quiet walls of its chambers, they whispered of the horror. How easy it was for a sane man to be committed. How simple it was to forge the stamp of insanity. The doctor's oath, the notary's seal, the relative's plea, all instruments of a system that could swallow reason whole. Mr. Newman's lawsuit was the spark, but the fire spread quickly. 3. The dancer, the gardener, and the heiress. Miss Celia Golding had once been a dancer, her name printed in gilt upon Broadway playbills for the Desert Song and artists and models. But her applause faded in the echoing halls of Rockland State Hospital, where she was held 2 years under a commitment she swore was false. When she walked free, her hair had turned gray at the temples. She filed suit to be declared sane by law, as if reason itself required notarization. A gardener named Morris Edelowitz fared no better. He tended roses for the family of Florence Gibb Pratt, daughter of the oil magnate Herbert L. Pratt. He wrote her letters, too tender, too frequent, and for that offense was sent to Kings Park Hospital, declared dangerous, held 3 months among the raving and the broken. He said he dreamed every night of pruning roses in the asylum garden, their thorns dripping not dew but laudanum. The Pratts denied it all, claiming competent physicians had called him irrational. He emerged to find the roses dead and the girl gone to England. There was also Mrs. Myrtle de Montes, who suffered food poisoning and wandered from her home in delirium. Mistaken for a vagrant lunatic, she was taken to Steilacoom Asylum, where for 4 months she lived bound in wet canvas and fed through a spouted kettle. The attendants made her scrub the stone floors until her skin split. When she spoke of her innocence, they wrote in the chart, "Persistent delusion of sanity." 4. The mirror of madness. Even the learned were not safe. In Boston, Miss Elizabeth Boyle O'Reilly, of a family both ancient and respected, spent 1.5 years in a private asylum. She escaped only by chance, her sanity later confirmed by the courts. Of her time inside, she wrote, "I knew I was sane, but that nobody would believe it. The very fact of my confinement was proof enough. A raised eyebrow, a word too sharply spoken, a glance too long, all were tokens of madness in the eyes of those who watched me. It was the same everywhere. The mere act of defending one's reason was itself considered proof of its absence." 5. Echoes in the corridors. The grand jury's findings were damning. They recommended that all commitments henceforth be filed in duplicate, one with the Department of Mental Hygiene, so that no man's name might be forged again. They proposed that only a state officer, not a relative, should deliver the papers that condemned the accused. They even dared suggest that psychiatrists swear their oaths before a judge. But the wheels of reform turned slower than those of madness. The asylums remained, the ledgers multiplied, and the ink continued to flow. Charles Reade had warned of this a century before in Hard Cash, calling it chaining the sane among the insane. But few believed that such cruelty could endure into the modern age. Yet here in the polished rooms of New York, men and women of wealth and standing vanished into madhouses with the stroke of a pen. 6. The Last Ledger. One autumn evening, long after the trials had ended and the public's outrage cooled, a clerk cleaning the archives of Harlem Valley Hospital found a drawer that would not open. When he forced it, a single file slid forward, yellowed with age. Inside was the commitment order of George H. Newman, the man who had begun it all. The ink had faded, but beneath the scrawl of false signatures was something else. A small note written in a different hand, faint and hurried. He was calm. He was kind. He was sane. God forgive us. The clerk closed the file and placed it back into the drawer. But as he turned to leave, he thought he heard something. The slow, deliberate scratching of a pen on paper, echoing from deep within the walls. The seamstress of the ward, Blackwell's Asylum, 1874. They called her Martha O'Shea, though her records listed no surname. She had been a seamstress in the city, brought to the lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island after nervous exhaustion left her unable to work. The asylum was overcrowded, built for a few hundred, but housing nearly 2,000. The air thick with the scent of carbolic acid and despair. By day, Martha stitched uniforms for the nurses. By night, she mended shrouds. The sewing ward was cold, and her hands bled from the rough thread used on burial garments. When she complained, the attendants told her, You are fortunate to have work. One night in March 1874, an orderly found her speaking to the air, whispering as she sewed. He laughed until he saw the thread move on its own. The next morning, the ward was silent. With black silk, the attendant found one final garment folded neatly at the foot of her bed. A burial shroud stitched with her own name, written in looping thread that no one could unpick. In the register, the doctor wrote, "Patient removed to Hart Island for burial." But the boatman swore she was never among the dead that day. The Reverend's Ledger, Chapel of Charity, 1882. Reverend William Glennie French was a real man, chaplain of Blackwell's Island, a reformer and spiritual caretaker to the condemned. In life, he believed he could save souls. In time, he learned the island would not let them go. His journals, recovered after his death, describe a strange occurrence on All Souls' Eve, 1882. That night, as fog rolled off the East River, the Reverend entered the asylum chapel alone. The wardens had asked him to record the names of those who had died that year. Over 700 inmates, felons, and paupers. But when he opened the register, the pages were already filled. The handwriting was not his own. Each line listed a name, a date, and a cause of death, all correct, until he reached the final page. There, written in trembling ink, was his own name, followed by the words, "To be taken at dawn." He fled into the corridors, calling for the guards, but the halls were empty. The gas lamps flickered and hissed. He swore he saw figures walking, the drowned, the starved, the shackled. By morning, the island physician found the Reverend seated in his pew, eyes open, heart stopped. The ledger lay open beside him. The last entry had been blotted over as if the paper itself refused to speak it. Third, the sound beneath the ward. Penitentiary, 1891. In 1891, the Blackwell's Island Penitentiary was a hell unto itself, a crumbling fortress filled with the poor, the criminal, and the forgotten. The prisoners dug trenches for sewage from the almshouse, and the stench of the river was constant. That summer, workmen began tunneling beneath the asylum's southern wing to repair a collapsed sewer. They found more than pipes. Buried in the silt were hundreds of bones, their arrangement too deliberate to be accidental. The superintendent ordered silence for the sake of public confidence. But the convicts swore that when they dug too deep, they heard voices coming from below. Not cries, but laughter. At night, the sound echoed up through the drains. The guards dismissed it as the wind off the East River, but those who listened too long began to lose their minds. One prisoner, an Irish laborer named Finnegan, gouged his ears and screamed, "The floor is speaking! They are counting us!" A week later, the tunnel collapsed, burying 6 men alive. The warden closed the site, filled it with lime, and sealed it forever. The next winter, when a new building rose over the buried pit, its foundation stones were found warm to the touch, even as snow fell. Historical note: each of these stories is rooted in real accounts documented by Stacy Horn, whose reformers and physicians trapped in the labyrinthine cruelty of Blackwell's Island, New York's 19th century repository for the poor, sick, mad, and criminal. Horn's research draws from archival city records, official reports, and the writings of Nellie Bly, whose 1887 expose, 10 Days in a Madhouse, first revealed the horrors of the asylum.
When